If we really want to speed things up, however, we need to move to actual multiple cores. Okay, so here we have the idea of, we have just our regular old processor, right? We already saw this where we have our single core where things can be processed. We've seen a diagram like this before. A multiple core processor, right? You hear about like dual core processors and quad core processors. Essentially, this is the idea of building two processors into one chip, right? So it's being sold as one physical component, but inside that one physical component, there are two actual processing cores. And each core has its own dedicated piece of processing resources. What we also can do is using hyperthreading along with a multiple core processor, each core can now do two instructions at once, which means that we can emulate as though we have four processors in this dual core scenario. Or in a quad core where we have four cores inside the processor, we can do 8 processes at once. So it's like we're emulating having 8 processor cores. You can see this in your system. I know one of the easy ways to see it, I know I see it, is when you use, speaking of virtualization technology, if you use something like Hyper-V or VMware for virtualization, when you go to create a virtual machine, that machine is going to ask you how much of the processor you want to use, and very often there's a drop down saying how many processing cores, or sometimes they'll say processing threads, do you want to allocate to that virtual machine. Okay, that's a real common place where I've seen it. Another place you can go is you can go into the task manager in Windows, and you can see the different threads there as well. But if you had a quad core processor, or an example I can use is the computer that I use here, I actually have dual quad core processors. And what that means is, and I'll tell you what, as long as I've mentioned it, let's kind of jump to this. That means there's actually 2 processors, right? So here's the actual motherboard, and this is what, remember I showed you in the motherboards lesson and we saw a heat sink and a fan, we couldn't see the processor? Well, this is a picture with the heat sink and fan removed. This is what the actual processor chip looks like. And each of these processors in my computer is a quad core processor that also supports hyperthreading. So what that means is that each processor has 4 cores. It can hyperthread, which means it emulates 8 cores. And there's 2 of them, so that's 16. So when I go in, I get to actually see what looks like I have 16 processors in my computer. And that's how I can run so many different things on my computer when I'm creating these courses for you. All right, so this is how we can get to multiple cores, is you can actually have multiple processors themselves. And then, another way is within the processors, we now have multiple cores.